A cardboard jewelry box sitting in a closet since before 1979 can hold a piece worth thousands of dollars. The exact same box, priced at $3 on a folding table at an estate sale because nobody flipped it over, can end up quietly funding a stranger's next vacation instead of yours. The difference between those two outcomes has nothing to do with how big the stone looks, how much it sparkles, or whether it looks real. It comes down to one detail almost everybody skips without realizing they're skipping it. The tiny signature stamped into the metal on the back. 10 brands, 1 habit. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly which names to hunt for in your own jewelry box, which pieces look so much like cheap costume junk that most people walk straight past them, and roughly what each one might actually be worth in today's market, including one name near the very end tied directly to a real duchess and a real royal scandal. Before we get into the list, build one habit right now, because everything in this video depends on it. Turn the piece over. Read the back. That's the entire secret hiding underneath nearly a century of costume jewelry. A gorgeous-looking brooch with nothing stamped on it is usually worth a few dollars, no matter how good it looks under a lamp. The exact same brooch, same design, same year, same materials, but with the right name pressed into the metal, can be worth hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars to the right buyer. Nobody teaches you this, and nobody in the modern jewelry business has any reason to tell you either. Retail jewelry stores make their money selling you new collections, new seasonal drops, new reasons to walk back in. Nobody in that industry benefits from you finding out that a box gathering dust in your grandmother's closet might be worth more than anything sitting in their display case right now. And this isn't some niche hobby that only a handful of collectors care about. Vintage costume jewelry has become one of the fastest-growing corners of the collectibles market over the last several years, driven by exactly the kind of buyer who grew up watching their mother or grandmother wear these pieces and now has the money to chase them down at auction. That demand is precisely why prices on some of these names have climbed so sharply in such a short window. Why a box that might have sold for pocket change a decade ago can be worth real money today. So we're doing this differently. We're starting with the brands so easy to mistake for fake that people genuinely believe they're worthless, and working our way up to the name that has fooled more estate sale buyers than any other piece of jewelry in America. Number 10, Napier. If you picture a classic American costume jewelry mark, this is one of the names your memory is probably reaching for, even if you can't quite place it. Napier operated for most of the 20th century, and until the late 1980s, every piece was stamped simply Napier in block letters. Later, switching to a script signature, a detail that alone can help date a piece within a few decades. What most people overlook is that Napier produced a genuine sterling silver line, particularly during the years of metal rationing in the 1940s. And those sterling pieces sit in a completely different category from the brand's ordinary base metal output. A basic signed Napier piece typically sells for $20 to $50, unremarkable on its own. But sterling silver Napier necklaces have sold for over $300, and complete matching parure sets, a necklace, bracelet and earrings all sharing one design, climb considerably higher than any single piece alone. The factory closed for good in 1999, which means every sterling piece that exists today is a fixed, shrinking supply. If your mark reads Napier in block letters and the metal feels heavier and cooler than typical costume jewelry, check for a sterling stamp before you assume you're holding an ordinary piece. Number 9. Sarah Coventry. This is the name most likely to trigger an actual memory rather than blank recognition, because for decades, Sarah Coventry jewelry wasn't sold in stores at all. It was sold at home parties, hosted by a neighbor, presented by a saleswoman, the exact kind of gathering an entire generation of American women attended regularly. Most Sarah Coventry pieces sell modestly, typically in the $10 to $50 range, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But certain designs, especially complete boxed sets with the original presentation packaging intact and rarer purple and colored rhinestone pieces from specific years, have sold well over $100, with some documented sales climbing past $150. The detail that decides it here is completeness and packaging. A Sarah Coventry piece still sitting in its original gift box, the way it would have been presented at that living room party decades ago, is worth meaningfully more than the identical piece loose in a drawer, because that box is proof of exactly how well it was cared for from day one. If your mother or grandmother ever hosted or attended one of those parties, there's a real chance the evidence is still sitting in a box somewhere in the house. Number 8. Monet. Monet is one of the most recognizable names in American costume jewelry. Precisely because it was never trying to hide, it was a genuine department store mainstay for decades. The company started in 1927 under the name Monocraft, switching to the Monet name around 1937, and that distinction matters enormously to collectors. Early monocraft pieces from that first decade, along with a small run of sterling silver pieces made during the metal shortages of the Second World War, are dramatically rarer than the mass-produced designs that followed in the 1960s and 70s. A typical signed Monet brooch sells in the $20 to $300 range, depending on design and condition, but complete matched jewelry sets, and pieces still carrying their original glass rhinestones, boxes and tags, have sold for considerably more, with large matched collections reaching into the thousands. The detail that decides it is the exact wording on the back. Monocraft specifically, or an early plain Monet mark without a copyright symbol, points to the valuable early years. A copyright symbol next to the name means mid-1950s or later, still collectible, but a completely different tier of rarity. Number 7. Coro, later rebranded Coro Craft and Vendôme for its finer lines. Coro was one of the single largest costume jewelry manufacturers of the entire 20th century, which is exactly the trap. Because it made so much jewelry, people assume common automatically means cheap, and they're wrong more often than they'd expect. The name comes from its two founders, Emanuel Cohn and Carl Rosenberger, Co from Cohn, Ro from Rosenberger. And over the decades, the company rebranded its better pieces under the Vendôme name, which collectors today treat as a genuine step above standard Coro output. What makes Coro genuinely sneaky is a mechanism called the duet, two separate clip brooches that lock together into one larger fur clip using a single detachable frame, an engineering trick almost nobody making costume jewelry today would bother with. If you own a piece that separates cleanly into two smaller pins, you are not looking at a broken brooch, you are looking at a duet, and that changes the conversation entirely. A standard signed Coro piece in good condition typically sells in the $60 to $100 range, but a rare, clearly marked duet, especially a figural design like a bird or floral spray from the late 1930s, has sold at auction for well over $1,800, even with visible wear. Number 6. Eisenberg, both the original mark and the later Eisenberg ice line. Here's the part almost nobody knows. Eisenberg wasn't originally a jewelry company at all. It started as a clothing retailer, and the jewelry was only ever meant to be decorative pins sewn onto the garments to help sell them. Customers kept unpinning the jewelry and walking off with just that instead of buying the dress, and the company eventually gave up and turned jewelry into the actual business. Eisenberg used genuine Austrian crystal with a noticeably higher lead content than competitors, which is why decades-old Eisenberg rhinestones still throw more light than jewelry made half as long ago. The sterling pieces from the war years, when metal was restricted, are the ones to watch hardest for, since they were only produced for a few short years. A clean, signed Eisenberg original in clear rhinestones commonly sells in the $200 to $400 range. And rare sterling pieces from the 1940s have pushed well past that at specialty auctions, with one entire private collection grossing close to $100,000 in a single sale. If a piece in your box is marked ice and you assumed that meant fake, you had it backwards. Number 5. Trifari. This is where the money starts getting genuinely serious. Trifari's longtime head designer, Alfred Philippe, insisted on hand-setting every rhinestone into an individual prong, rather than gluing stones flat against the metal. And that single construction detail is still the easiest way to separate a genuine Trifari piece from a cheaper imitation made the very same year. Run a finger gently along the setting. You can actually feel the prongs holding each stone rather than a flat glued surface. And look on the back for Trifari's crown mark, used consistently across decades of production. A signed Trifari piece in good condition typically starts around $150, and pieces made with poured glass or unusual stone cutting techniques have sold for over $4,000 at recent auctions. One enamel and rhinestone necklace cut to imitate emeralds and diamonds sold for $3,600 in 2024 alone. Trifari's most famous figural pieces, nicknamed jelly bellies by collectors, used a molded lucite body to imitate a polished gemstone inside the shape of an animal, a duck, a fish, a poodle. If you own anything shaped like an animal, where the color sits inside the body of the piece instead of painted onto the surface, check the back immediately. Number 4. Kenneth J. Lane, often signed simply KJL. This is the name on tonight's list with the strangest real-world backstory, and it involves an actual duchess. Kenneth J. Lane trained at the Rhode Island School of Design, worked in the art department at Vogue, and designed jewel-encrusted shoes for Christian Dior himself before launching his own costume jewelry line in 1963. His career changed overnight when the Duchess of Windsor, formerly Wallis Simpson, the woman King Edward VIII abdicated the British throne to marry, was seen wearing his jewelry and began recommending him personally to her social circle. Society reporters ran with the story, and Kenneth J. Lane went from unknown to sought after almost overnight. His Treasures of the Duchess necklace, designed and named directly after her, has sold at auction for over $4,600. And Lane himself remained fashionable enough decades later to sell extensively on television, long after most of his 1960s peers had faded from memory. A signed KJL piece from the 1960s in good condition regularly sells in the $200 to $800 range, with rarer documented pieces climbing considerably higher. If you have a piece signed KJL or Kenneth Lane tucked away, you are holding a name a real duchess once wore publicly enough to launch an entire career. Number 3. Miriam Haskell. Haskell pieces almost never carry an obvious signature. Most of them have no maker's mark at all. Because Miriam Haskell wasn't a designer herself, she was the businesswoman who hired talented designers and put her name on the finished result. And a huge number of her pieces went out the door completely unsigned. So identification here comes almost entirely from construction, not from a stamp. Genuine Haskell pieces are hand-wired, one bead and one seed pearl at a time, onto a filigree, backing rather than molded or glued the way most competing costume jewelry from the same decades was assembled. Turn a piece over and look at the back of the beadwork itself. If you can see individual wire wraps holding each element in place rather than a solid cast backing, that's your signal. A single signed or attributable Haskell necklace with this hand-wired construction, has sold in the $950 to $2,400 range, depending on complexity. And a complete matching parure necklace, bracelet and earrings together has gone even higher at specialty auctions. This is the brand most likely sitting in a box-marked costume, unsigned, at an estate sale, priced like it's nothing because the seller assumed no signature meant no value. Number 2, Schreiner of New York. If Miriam Haskell teaches you that unsigned doesn't mean worthless, Schreiner takes that lesson to its extreme. The overwhelming majority of Schreiner pieces were never signed at all. Only the ones made specifically for department stores carry a stamp, while everything made for major fashion houses, including work done for Christian Dior's own runway shows, went out completely unmarked. So how do you identify a piece worth thousands with no name on it anywhere? You look for one deliberately strange design choice. Schreiner set many of its rhinestones upside down, point side facing up instead of down, specifically so the stone underneath would pick up the color of whatever the wearer had on. Combine that with hook and eye construction on the back instead of soldered flat settings, oversized keystone-shaped crystals, and dome-shaped brooches in color combinations no other manufacturer of the era was willing to attempt, and you have a piece almost nobody recognizes sitting in plain sight. A single unsigned Schreiner necklace with clearly inverted stones has sold for over $2,200, and signed pieces in excellent condition have climbed considerably higher at dedicated vintage jewelry auctions. Schreiner is quite literally the brand that was designed to be mistaken for something ordinary. And number 1, the name at the very top of this list, Christian Dior's costume jewelry line. Most people hear Christian Dior and think fashion runway, not costume jewelry sitting in a thrift store bin. And that gap between expectation and reality is exactly what makes this the most overlooked entry on the entire list. Dior never actually made his own jewelry in-house. Instead, he commissioned the finest costume houses of the era to produce it under his name, including designers like Henkel and Grosser and Joseph Griep, which means a single Christian Dior signature on the back can represent work from several different world-class ateliers, depending on the year. The line leaned heavily on genuine Swarovski Aurora Borealis crystal, the rainbow-shifting rhinestone finish introduced in 1955 that changes color depending on the angle of light hitting it, set with a level of precision that costume jewelry rarely received elsewhere. Look on the back for Christian Dior stamped in block letters, sometimes alongside a small copyright symbol and a year. One of the only brands on this entire list that occasionally tells you exactly when the piece was made. A clean signed Dior costume piece regularly sells in the $400 to $700 range, and design-specific pieces, like a red glass bead necklace created during John Galliano's tenure at the house, have sold for $4,400 at auction. Of everything on this list, Dior is the name most likely to get mistaken for a modern department store knockoff by someone who has genuinely never looked at the back. So what actually connects all 10 of these names? Every single one of them made jewelry designed to imitate something more expensive than it was. Glass pretending to be emerald, plated metal pretending to be gold, rhinestone pretending to be diamond. And that exact quality is what makes them so easy to dismiss today. If a piece looks fake, most people stop right there and assume the story is over. But looking convincingly fake was the entire design goal for every brand on this list. The imitation was the point, and decades later that same imitation, done well by the right hands, is worth real money to collectors who know exactly what they're looking at. Run back through those 10 names for a second and notice the pattern in how each one hides. Napier hides behind being so common nobody stops to check for the rare sterling line. Coventry hides behind being a home party brand nobody associates with real value. Monet hides behind being too recognizable to seem special. Coro hides behind sheer volume. Eisenberg hides behind a word, ice, that sounds like an insult instead of a compliment. Trifari hides in plain sight behind a crown most people never think to look for. Kenneth J hides behind a name people assume is modern costume jewelry rather than a 1960s original. Haskell hides behind having no mark at all. Schreiner hides behind a deliberately upside-down stone that looks like a manufacturing mistake instead of a signature style. And Dior hides behind an assumption that a name this famous couldn't possibly be sitting in a bargain bin. Every single one of them is hiding for a different reason, and every single one of them is found the exact same way. Now let me be completely honest with you, because that's the only reason this channel works the way it does. Not every piece from these 10 brands is worth a fortune, and it would be dishonest to let you believe otherwise. Condition changes everything. Missing stones, tarnish, and cracked enamel can cut a piece's value down to a small fraction of what a clean example brings. Rarity matters just as much. A common mass-produced design, even from the most prestigious name on this list, may still only be worth a modest amount if thousands of the same piece were made. And on the more valuable brands, especially, signatures have occasionally been added to lesser pieces or reproduced outright. So if you genuinely believe you found something significant, it's worth having an independent appraiser confirm it before you try to sell. But here's the math that makes this worth your time anyway. Turning a piece over and reading the back costs you nothing. No appointment, no fee, no expertise, just 30 seconds and a decent light. Selling a genuine Schreiner necklace or a real Miriam Haskell parure for $2 at a yard sale because nobody bothered to check costs you everything that piece was actually worth. So before anything else from that box goes into a donation bag, a scrap pile, or a $5 folding table in somebody's driveway, take the time to flip every single piece over and actually read what's stamped into the back. Tell me in the comments which of these 10 names you found in your own collection, and describe the piece if you can. I read every comment on these videos, and whatever else you do this week, don't sell anything from that box until you've checked.